Welcome to our evening with Yaa Gyasi and guest host Rochelle Riley, presented by the National Writers Series. First, we'd like to thank our major sponsors, Cordia, West Shore Bank, the Northwest Michigan Arts and Culture Network, and Mission Point Press. I'm Lisa Thavet, a Montessori consultant and an improv performer. I'm also a board member of the National Writers Series. I joined this wonderful nonprofit out of love for the power of storytelling and how it can transform lives. This is especially true of Yaa Gyasi's newest book, Transcendent Kingdom, which has been an instant New York Times bestseller, landing #3 on the chart the first week it was out. Transcendent Kingdom is a deeply layered story about a Ghanaian family living in Alabama. It centers around the life of Gifty, the youngest sibling and a doctoral student at Stanford University, studying the neural circuits of rats to uncover secrets of addiction. Her interest is scientific, but also intensely personal. Gifty's search for answers leads her to re-examine her faith and her religious upbringing. I am so pleased to welcome back as a guest host Rochelle Riley, who is an author in her own right, having published several books, including The Burden, African Americans and the Enduring Impact of Slavery, which has garnered rave reviews. She is co-author of the upcoming That They Lived, a collection of essays about famous African Americans. Riley worked for more than 20 years for the Detroit Free Press and now serves as Executive Director of Arts, Culture, and Entertainment for the City of Detroit. She has been inducted into the Journalism Hall of Fame in both Michigan and North Carolina. Yaa Gyasi was born in Ghana and raised in Huntsville, Alabama. She holds a BA in English from Stanford University and an MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop, where she held a Dean's Graduate Research Fellowship. Her previous book, Homegoing, was winner of several awards, including the Penn Hemingway Award and NBCC's John Leonard Prize. It was shortlisted for the British Book Award Debut of the Year. It was also listed as a notable book for the New York Times and Washington Post, and chosen as a Best Book of the Year by National Public Radio. Yaa lives in New York City. I am so looking forward to this conversation, so let's all welcome to the National Writers Series virtual stage, Rochelle Riley and Yaa Gyasi.
I am applauding you. Yeah, I am so thrilled to be here talking with you. I love this book, I, like Oprah Winfrey, love this book. But I want to start tonight's conversation with Homegoing, which literally was reviewed as a debut historical novel of breathtaking sweep and emotional power that traces 300 years in Ghana, and along the way also becomes a truly great American novel, extraordinary for its exquisite language, implacable sorrow, soaring beauty, and monumental portrait of the forces that shape families and nations. So I'm like, wow, drop the mic. So before we dive into Transcendent Kingdom, I want to talk a little bit about that. Your first book, and I mean, you know, National Book Critics Circle's John Leonard Award, the National Book Foundation's 5 Under 35, the Dylan Thomas Prize Long List, American Book Award, and there's more and more and more. Talk a little bit about how you decided to do that book. This one's very different, so I want to make sure I understand that history.
Sure. Well, you know, they always say that it takes you your entire life to write your first book, or that you were working toward your first book for, you know, your entire life until that book comes out. And that felt very true for me. Homegoing is very much a book that aims to, I think, examine identity, particularly Ghanaian and American identity. It questions what it means to have inherited this legacy of slavery and colonialism. It attempts to kind of look at the diaspora as a family. And I wrote it in great part because I had always felt as though I was kind of existing in these liminal spaces. For those who don't know, Homegoing is a novel that follows the family lineage of two half-sisters born in the Gold Coast in the 18th century, One of the sisters lives in the Cape Coast Castle, which is a slave fort, as the wife of the British governor of that castle. The other sister is kept in that same castle as an enslaved woman before being sent to America. And the novel moves generation by generation down to the last one. And I think that I wrote it because, well, for so many reasons, but one of the reasons was that, you know, my family had come to America and we had ended up in Alabama, where, you know, the effects of the slave trade were still so strongly felt in these kind of keen, observable ways. And the fact that I came from a country that had this castle, it has other castles too, but these monuments to slavery that still sit on Ghanaian land, I really wanted to kind of interrogate those links. And so my sophomore year of college, I got this research grant to travel to Ghana and conduct research for a novel. At the time, I had a totally different idea in mind. But then my friend Stefan came to visit. He wanted to go see the Cape Coast Castle. We went, we took the tour that they give to anyone. The Obamas had actually just been there the week before us on tour, so there was like a lot of fanfare around the castle. And it's the only time in my writing life where I felt anything akin to a stroke of inspiration. I just knew immediately that I wanted to write about this place, what had taken place there. It felt haunted, and I felt haunted by the story.
How overwhelming was the praise? I mean, everybody wants whatever book they write to be, you know, embraced and beloved and make the New York Times bestseller list. But talk for a little bit about what that was like.
Overwhelming indeed. It was, you know, I always say it feels like writing the first book feels like you're writing in the dark, completely unsure about whether or not your book will ever see the light of day. And the fact that my book not only saw light, but that that light was so bright, was more than I could have ever dreamed of or imagined. And I felt incredibly fortunate, filled with kind of gratitude for all of the people who had taken me seriously over the years, taken my dreams seriously over the years, and certainly some amount of nervousness and just kind of pressure as well. But it was an experience that is really one in a million, and I'm so thankful that that people responded to the book with so much just love.
Well, it is absolute love. And I'll only ask one more question about the old book before we talk about the new book.
Sure.
You do have that type of overwhelming praise, and you've written something that magnificent. How soon did you think you'd be ready to write the next book, and how much trepidation was there about that?
Yeah, I was really surprised by how long it took me to work my way into the second novel, because I am a person who has always written, really, since I was a child. I had always been kind of working on something or thinking about something. And after homegoing, suddenly I found myself with this entirely new role, which was the role that I hadn't considered as part of the career of a writer, this kind of public facing role. And so suddenly I was doing things that I had never done before, events and tours, traveling, staying in hotels, ordering lots of room service, and that kind of that busyness and also that kind of noisy excitement. I think it took me a while to return to the quietude I think that you need in order to write another book. So once I started teaching myself just how to say no to things, how to carve out time for myself to write, but also how to kind of listen to myself and listen to that voice in my head that is seeking out a story. Suddenly all of the rest of it kind of fell away and I was able to actually write this book. But it took me several months. I would say Homegoing came out in 2016 and I started writing this early 2017. So about 6 months of no writing, which was rare for me.
Well, now let's get into this book, Transcendent Kingdom, which, as I told you when I first met you, was transcendent. It is totally different from the historical fiction of the first book. So can you talk a little bit, so all of these people who are going to buy this book at an independent bookstore first thing tomorrow can have a glimpse at what it's like? what it's about.
Sure. So Transcendent Kingdom is about a woman named Gifty who is getting her doctorate in neuroscience. And she studies the neural circuitry of reward-seeking behavior, which, don't worry if you don't know what that means. The book takes you through all of that. But basically, she studies addiction and depression. And it's at a time in her life when her own mother, who is suffering from depression, comes to stay with her. So she finds herself taking care of her mother while working toward her final thesis project, and also reflecting back on her childhood, particularly the years that led up to her beloved older brother, Nana's passing from a heroin overdose. So it's a book about difficult mother-daughter relationships. It's a book about sibling relationships. It is a book about immigration, about racism, about what we do in order to kind of make a life for ourselves after we have experienced some trauma in our younger years.
I want to talk a little bit about one other thing that it's about, and it's depression. And this search that this scientist has for whatever she's trying to find in mice that can help with humans. I kept calling this a new Of Mice and Men story. So that's not what it's about. Yeah. But there is a lot of science. There is a lot. There are a lot of references. The amount of research. The archival, if we were talking about a documentary. What made you decide to include that? It really does make the book. And I learned so much, but talk a little bit about the decision that you made for this to be a contemporary novel about a woman who's really, really smart.
Yeah, I would love to talk about that. So the science really came first, and it was the thing that formed the idea. I was living in Berkeley at the time that I started writing this. I had just finished Homegoing and had just published Homegoing rather, and one of my closest friends from childhood was getting her PhD in neuroscience at Stanford at the time, and she had a major paper that was about to be released. And she had been so supportive of me. I wanted to be supportive of her. So I sat down to read this paper, and I could not understand a single sentence of it. It went completely over my head. And so really out of curiosity at that point, I didn't think I was going to write about her work. I asked if I could go shadow her in her lab. She very generously said yes. The day that I went, she performed a surgery on her mice that I detail in the early pages of this novel. And I was just kind of hooked from there. It was so different from anything that I spent my days thinking about. And the implications that her work had on human life, I found so fascinating and really, I feel like touched upon things that I spent my days thinking about anyway, like what it means to kind of seek out pleasure, what it means to kind of seek out happiness or anything in the midst of risk, of danger. Those things felt very human to me, even though she was researching mice and thinking about mice, but the implications of it I found to be really interesting and felt like they could map themselves on quite well to a narrative. So that was the beginning of this for me. I didn't want to shy away from the science, but at the same time, I am a lay person. I hadn't taken a science class since, freshman year of college. So I had to do a lot of research to get comfortable talking about it, but keeping myself in mind, keeping that awareness that I was a person who didn't know this world and on a technical level, I think helped to write it in such a way that that science is still accessible, and you're learning and you're being able to apply the things that you're learning to real lives. So it was a pleasure, and it felt very much like stretching new muscles for me.
Well, I had originally asked if you would read a chapter or an excerpt that had to do with the mice in the lab, but instead I wanted you to read something about the relationship between brother and sister, because it is so special and you capture these characters so amazingly. Would you read for our audience for just a minute?
Yes,
that portion
I would love to.
One of the funniest moments in the book.
Yes, I would love to. And also I should say thank you so much, Rochelle, and thank you to the National Writers Series for having me. This is wonderful.
We're thrilled.
Um, in Hamilton and Freemau's 1985 study on the effects of cognitive behavioral training on basketball free throw performance, researchers asked 3 college basketball players with low game to practice free throw ratios to listen to tape recordings with instructions for deep muscle relaxation. The men were also tasked with watching videotapes of themselves playing basketball while attempting to reconstruct the thoughts they were having in each moment that played back to them. The researchers wanted them to identify any moments when they experienced negative self-evaluation and to instead try to cultivate positive self-statements. So instead of thinking, I'm the worst, I've never been good at anything in my life, how did I even make it onto this team? They were to aim for, I got this, I'm capable, I'm here for a reason. By the end of the training program, all 3 subjects had improved by at least 50%. I don't know what thoughts ran through Nana's mind in those days. I wish I did. Because of my career, I would give a lot to be able to inhabit someone else's body, to think what they're thinking, feel what they're feeling. For a copy of Nana's thoughts from birth to death, bound in book form, I would give absolutely anything, everything. But since accessing his mind has never been possible, I resort to speculating, assuming, feeling, modes of logic with which I have never been entirely comfortable. My guess is that it wasn't just Nana's body that couldn't sit still. He had a mind that was always thrumming. He was curious, intense, often quiet. And when he asked a question, there were 100 more lurking behind it. This constant striving for exactness, the right position for his legs, the right thing to say, was what made him someone who could shoot free throws for hours on end. But it also made him someone who had a harder time changing the narrative, getting from the negative self-statement to a positive one. When he said, I don't give a fuck what he thinks, he said it in such a way that it was abundantly clear to me that this was precisely what he cared most about. And because Nana cared deeply, thought deeply, I imagine that these things were the kinds of negative self-statements he would reconstruct if he were to have watched a video of himself playing basketball or simply living his life. It didn't hurt his game any, but it hurt him in other ways. Maybe it would have helped if we were the kind of family who talked about our feelings, who indulged in an I love you, a little abrofu kwasiasen every now and again. Instead, I never told Nana how proud I was of him, how much I loved seeing him on the basketball court. On the game days when our mother was at work, I would walk to Nana's high school to watch him play, and then I would wait for him to finish talking to the other players and come out of the locker room so that he and I could walk back home together. Good job, Nana, I would say when he finally came out in a fog of Axe body spray. Nana's coach always left as soon as the final whistle blew, so the only adult who would still be around was the night janitor, a man whom both Nana and I avoided because his job always made us think about our father. Y'all sure don't act like any siblings I've ever seen, the janitor said that one night. I mean, good job, Nana, like he's your employee or your student or something. You should be giving him a hug. Come on, man, Nana said. I'm serious, y'all don't act like you hardly know each other. Go on and give your sister a hug, he said. Nah, man, we're good, Nana said. He started walking toward the door. Let's go, Gifty, he said, but I was still standing there, looking at the janitor who was giving me a kids these days kind of head shake. Gifty, Nana shouted without turning, and I ran to catch up. I'd left our house when it was still light out, but by the time the two of us got outside, it was a hot and humid night. Fireflies flashed their greetings all around us. Nana's long strides meant I had to hustle to keep up with him, a half shuffle, half jog that I had perfected over the years. Do you think it's weird we don't hug? I asked. Nana ignored me and quickened his pace. These were the Nana ignores everyone days. when my mother and I would steal commiserating glances at each other after one of his moody groans. To Nana, my mother would say, "You think you and me are size? Fix your face." To me, she would say, "This too shall pass." We lived about 1.5 miles away from the school, an easy walk by our mother's standards, but one we dreaded. Sidewalks in Huntsville were mostly decorative. People drove their SUVs to grocery stores 2 blocks away, their air conditioning on full blast. The only people who walked were people like us, people who had to walk because they had one car, one parent who worked double shifts even on game days, because walking was free and public transportation was either non-existent or unreliable. I hated the honking, the slurs yelled out through rolled down windows. Once, while I was walking by myself, a man in a pickup truck had driven slowly next to me, staring at me so hungrily, I grew afraid and ducked into the library, hid among the books until I was certain he hadn't followed me. But I liked walking with Nana on those spring nights when the weather was just starting its quick turn from pleasant to oppressive, when the cicadas' songs gave way to those of the katydids. I loved Alabama in the evenings when everything got still and lazy and beautiful, when the sky felt full, fat with bugs. Nana and I turned onto our street. One of the street lamps was out, and so there was a minute-long stretch of near darkness. Nana stopped walking. He said, "Do you want a hug?" My eyes were still adjusting to that patch of dark. I couldn't see his face, couldn't tell if he was serious or just making fun of me, but I considered the question carefully anyway. "No, not really," I said. Nana started laughing. He walked those last couple of blocks unhurriedly, at my pace, so that I could walk beside him. I'll stop there. Oh, you're muted.
I'm coming out. I just didn't want to scream on camera. All I was saying was wow, wow, wow. Because in just those few pages, you captured the essence of a relationship between a brother and sister, of a family and their history and how they interact, of the place where they are. I mean, literally, that's one of the most amazing things, and a little science thrown in for good measure, because if I read that paragraph first, like if I just walked in the bookstore and read that, I would go, oh no, this is something hard. But when you get into every bit of science that's in the book, every study, everything that you found, which helped define and helped you understand these real people, it was just amazing. So I want to ask a very odd question, because it's been, 5 years. Where were you when you wrote that particular passage?
Oh, that's a great question. I think when I wrote that particular passage, I was living in Berlin. I had received a fellowship from the American Academy in Berlin to spend 4 months working on this novel. And I had this kind of beautiful office on the lake in Wannsee. And it was the first time in my life that I had an office. And so I took great pleasure in walking down to that office and sitting at my desk and writing. And I think that I was thinking about Nana's basketball skills, and that it began with me kind of just researching basketball studies, or studies that had been done on basketball players. And once I read that particular study, I thought there was a way to kind of work in that idea that the messaging that we give ourselves can impact how we express ourselves. And that's how I started to create that connection.
Well, that is just stunning writing, and I'm so glad that you agreed to read that. I can't imagine anybody heard that and isn't ready to read all the rest of it, because there are so many other moments like that. We're going to get to questions from our very large audience in a minute, but I wanted to ask a little bit about when you wanted to be a writer. I'm a writer, and I've been a writer since I was 8 years old, but when did you know that this was your path, that you weren't going to try science? Well, you kind of knew, but that moment where you said, no matter how I do it, that's who I am.
Yeah, I love that you started when you were 8. I also started really young. I started when I was 7, and I can remember specifically what happened, which was that I was obsessed with reading Rainbow, obsessed with LeVar Burton. I watched every day. And one year, I noticed that he was making a call for the Reading Rainbow Young Writers and Illustrators competition. And I asked my parents if I could enter. And my father had this big old clunky typewriter that he pulled out from the closet, and let me type out my story. It was called Just Me and My Dog, and it was about a little girl who begs her parents for a dog, which was at that point my life story. And I sent it in to the competition, and I didn't win, but I got a certificate of achievement that was signed by LeVar Burton.
Oh, wow.
And that was my most prized possession at that point. And I think that was the first time that I had ever been kind of, not just that I had written a story, but that I had seen a response come back for the story that I had written. This like first kind of validation of this work that I wanted to do. And really from that moment on, it was always somewhere in the back of my mind that I wanted to be a writer. I didn't know that writing was like a career that you could have. I wasn't, you know, treating it like more than a hobby for most of my childhood. But I think once I started to kind of accept that this was something you could do as a profession, I knew that it was what I wanted to do.
Well, you do it very well. And there are some people in your past who expected that. As a matter of fact, I'm looking at the chat. Before we get to any questions, there's someone very special who was in and wanted to say hello. And we asked if she wanted to be on screen, and I think she's going to let us do that.
Oh, wonderful.
I know, I'm not going to say who it is. I'm just going to.
Such a surprise. I haven't been reading the chat, so.
Well, I like to read them, even though we have brilliant people who are going to like keep up with the questions. But if we can bring on this very special guest, who is, should we bring her on screen? If not, Jody, then we'll wait till we get to the questions and she can ask a question or say something then. But I just thought that was so cool.
Oh, that's lovely.
Well, there are even more messages coming in now. So, oh, she's gone.
Oh.
Not by to say hello. It was Miss Janice Vaughn.
Oh, that's so lovely.
So at least
yeah,
she was here. I was trying to get to her so she could say hi. But we'll make sure that you guys connect. And she's just so proud of you. So I just wanted to tell you, she's your former teacher who had great things to say in the chat about you.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Who knew us then can see us now.
Yeah, she was my junior year AP English language teacher, and one of the first teachers, I think, in that same vein. She was one of the first teachers to take my writing seriously, and to kind of allow me to believe that this dream was a possible dream. So I thank her in the acknowledgements of my first book, because she meant so much to me. So thank you, Ms. Vaughn, for coming.
Well, let's get to some of the questions because there's going to be quite a few, and I want to make sure that people have a chance to ask. So here's one from someone we both know, Ann Stanton, my friend, always lets me do these things. What was it like for you to grow up in Huntsville, and how much of the book was drawn from your own experiences?
Oh, Huntsville was such an interesting experience for me. So my family moved around quite a lot, actually, before we got to Huntsville. I immigrated to America when I was 2, but then we lived in Ohio, Illinois, Tennessee, and then Alabama when I was 9. And I think the starkest difference about being in Alabama was that I had this experience of kind of diminishing community. When my family arrived in America, we were kind of surrounded by other West Africans. We were members of the African Christian Church, which was half Nigerian, half Ghanaian. It felt like a soft landing in a lot of ways. And then each place we moved to, there were fewer and fewer other West Africans. And so I think my starkest memory of those first years in Huntsville is that there was one Ghanaian family in Meridianville that we would drive like half an hour to go see every once in a while. But Huntsville is the place that I still call home. It's where my parents live now, where my younger brother lives, and it was formative to me in so many ways, including including the teachers that I had, like Miss Vaughn. And yeah, I think it had an impact on me in ways that are still probably hard to articulate. But one is that I went to a church that was quite similar to the one that Gifty goes to in this book. And so I was definitely drawing from that experience to write that aspect of the novel.
Well, we've got a question from Becky Ewing, who wanted to, first of all, say she loved Homegoing and is excited to read the new book. And she learned so much about the terrible history of the slave trade. She thanks you for that. And she wants to know what you're reading now that inspires you. And she also wants you to describe her city.
Well, thank you for the question. I've been so inspired by so many of the books that I've been reading these past several months. Actually, I feel like I've been reading a ton over quarantine. I just finished yesterday reading Memorial Drive by Natasha Trethewey, who was a former U.S. poet laureate, but this is a memoir that she wrote that details the murder of her mother by her stepfather. It's an incredibly sad book, but also so beautifully written, inspiring on a number of ways, just from a language perspective, and also just from that perspective of being able to, again, like make a life beyond the childhood trauma that you've experienced. I so admire her work. I also just read Luster by Raven Leilani, which has been getting a lot of attention, and for good reason. It's really electric and really funny. So I loved that as well.
Okay, that's two I have to put on my list. We have one now from Phyllis. She wanted to learn more about your name, Yaa Gyasi, but whether there's some specific meaning, or if you could talk a little bit about where that came from.
Sure. So Yaa is the name given to a girl born on Thursday among the Akans, among the Ashanti. And so, yeah, it's it's a short story, but a good one, I think. I was born on Thursday. I got the name.
If we did that, boy, it would really make spelling a lot easier for a lot of people.
Yes, true.
Now we do have one from Gina as well, who wants to know what was the most pleasurable part to write in the book? And then conversely, what was the hardest part?
Oh, there were so many pleasurable parts to write in this book. It was such a really rich writing experience for me. I think there was something so nice about researching something that I didn't know anything about. It felt, after you leave university, sometimes it feels like, am I still learning new things? And this made me feel like, yes, indeed, I can still learn new things and still kind of wrap my head around concepts that I might have found challenging just months before. So the researching process of writing this book was really, really pleasant for me. I loved writing any of those scenes where you see Nana and Gifty interacting were really, really deeply enjoyable for me. And then the hardest part of writing this novel by far was the structure, because I had come off a book like Homegoing, which was so tightly constructed. It was, as many people have noted, ambitious and epic and sprawling in nature, but it also had almost kind of a mathematical constraint to it. There were 14 chapters, 14 POV characters, and it went through in a way that was really easy to recognize. By contrast, Transcendent Kingdom is very loosely structured. It's non-linear. It moves really at the pace of a life, and getting into that rhythm, I think, was the hardest part. But once I had done it, I felt like it was the most satisfying part as well.
Well, it was brilliantly done, because literally I would have had to have had note cards to keep up with all the different stories. like I was writing a script, and nothing was out of place. Every time I went someplace, I knew exactly where I was, which is very difficult to do when they're all in different time periods.
Yeah.
But before we take another question, I have good news. Janice Vaughn is back. She was
Oh, yay.
away for a second, so I'm hoping we can get her on screen. This is your former teacher, AP English. I know she's got to be proud. Miss Vaughn?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
We can
Yes.
hear you.
Wonderful. I just want to express to y'all once again how very, very proud I am of her. I want to tell her that when I sit and talk about her brilliance, my students in the past, because I've retired this summer, are so mesmerized by the things that I say about her. I remember her sitting in that 11 AP classroom, and I remember y'all kicking off her shoes at her desk. Do you remember that, y'all? I remember that sparkle in her eyes that really revealed that she is truly an artistic genius. She is really far and above, beyond what we can ever imagine as part of the human condition and the way she expresses how she feels about it. I do have a question for you though, y'all.
Okay.
When you think about Transcendent Kingdom, and I have looked at the novel in terms of an allegory, because I think that the characters and some of the events are very symbolic of harshnesses in our society, struggles that we face in our society, but also what it means to be human. Can you talk about perhaps where you see some of the symbolism in this novel in terms of the characters?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Miss Vaughn. This is so
You're
special
welcome.
to have you and to hear all of your thoughts. And I'm really grateful to you for the work that you did when I was young.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. I think that there is this sense of kind of allegory. I really wanted the mice to represent this sort of symbol of human life. Okay, I'm back, I think.
You're back.
Okay. There's a moment where Gifty is talking about something that her high school biology teacher says, where she says that Homo sapiens are the only animal to believe that they have transcended their kingdom, by which she means, kingdom animalia. Humans are the only animal to believe that they are not animals. Or that they are greater than animals. And so every time we get to see these mice in these circumstances that remind us of situations that humans are in, I think we're creating these linkages and thinking about the ways that we can kind of extrapolate on the experiences of any animal, and that humans are, as Eulabis has said, continuous with everything on this earth. So that, yeah, that was where that came from. And I see now my parents are on the screen.
I was going to say, we have another yes. I'd like to welcome to our conversation your parents, Sophia and
Hi. What a surprise.
Hello.
Hi.
How are you?
Good, thank you.
So proud.
Yes, thank you.
Do you have a question for your daughter?
When is she coming down here, baby? When are you coming to Huntsville?
Yeah, you need to ask the pandemic that, I think. But hopefully as soon as we can. Yeah.
Okay, babe.
Well, I do want to ask you two a question, Mr. and Mrs. Gyasi. Did you know all of this was going to happen when she was younger?
Well, I didn't know this was going to happen. I thought she was going to be a doctor because she said that when she was 6 years old, she wanted to be a doctor. And so that was what I was thinking all along. And then in her junior year in high school, she decided to do English and wanted to go to college to do English. So I didn't agree with that. I said, oh, you wanted to be a doctor. But after a few fights, we agreed on it and let her do what she wanted to do.
And look at how it's worked out in the end.
That's true.
Thank you so much for dropping in to say hello to her. And we all hope that she'll be able to get home to Huntsville soon.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
So awesome. When your parents and your high school teacher all show up for your
Well, it's so nice because in the virtual space, you know, you can't really see anyone. And so it's lovely to get a chance to actually see who's in the audience tonight. So thank you.
Well, this moment brought to you by the National Writers Series and Love. Let's get back to our audience. We've got a question from Richard. He heard you when you said POV character. I know what it is, but I want you to explain to all the readers what that term is.
Oh, sure. So POV character refers to point of view character. So I just meant that each chapter of Homegoing switches point of view. So suddenly you start with Afia, and then next chapter you're with a woman named Essie. The next chapter you're with a young man named Quay, and the point of view shifts. So we're following the story. It's still in third person perspective, but we're following a different character's kind of frame.
And we have a question from Richard. It has to do with vocabulary. One can often trust that an everyday reader will know and relate to certain words, metaphors, etc. For instance, in Homegoing, you described a bloody whip coming off her back like pulled taffy, which didn't exist in Ghana, at least until the early 19th century, or that Sam is as large as the Tower of Babel. How do you navigate the pros and cons of cross-cultural vocabulary as you understand it?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't know if I've put too much thought in it. I think Homegoing was really nice in that it allowed for this really pulled back, omniscient third perspective. I was trying to think of how to encapsulate about 300 years of history of these two countries, and to do so in a way that still felt continuous, and that read kind of seamlessly. And so obviously there were limitations in terms of what I could say was happening in a certain place at a certain time, given the truth of those situations. But I think the pleasure, or the just one of the utilities of an omniscient perspective is that they know so much more than the characters know. They see so much more than the characters see. And so I was really going for this kind of oracular, larger than life storytelling kind of a voice, a perspective that said, I hold the entirety of human history in my head. Any word is allowed to me. That's how I was thinking of it.
I love that author's prerogative. I do the same thing. My book, my word. I want to go back for just a second to the passage that you read, because it was about a brother and sister, and you mentioned, you know, there are two of you, you and your brother. Do you and your brother hug?
I actually have two brothers, and, and we do, yes, we do hug. So it's not, you know, that part is not autobiographical.
There's so many little moments, little details in the language, in the narrative, in some of the moments, the way you describe her mother's back lying in bed away from her, that she has to come home to that over and over and over. Are you doing that as you write, or do you go back in and put on another layer of writing on top of whatever you do the first time? Talk a little bit about the process.
I'm doing it as I write. I feel like a really kind of intuitive writer. I don't do a lot of pre-planning. Even for Homegoing, I didn't have an outline. So the way that I feel as though I'm going about it is that I'm kind of fumbling my way through the beginning. And the beginnings are the hardest part for me. With Homegoing, I threw out probably about 100 pages that just weren't working, until I landed on the first chapter.
Well, where are they? I
Transcendent.
want those 100 pages.
They're buried somewhere. Transcendent Kingdom, I threw out fewer pages, but it was still a similar process. I'm always kind of starting over until I land on just the right voice, the right tone, all of those things. And once I do, really, for both books, the first chapters are almost exactly the same as when I first wrote them. They don't change much. And I'm a pretty concise and I would say precise writer. I'm not one of these writers that writes like thousands of pages and then slashes to get to the end. I try as hard as I can to have the first draft be as close to finished as possible. And so, yeah, so things like that moment that you talked about, the curve of this woman's back, the slope of this woman's back. I think that was a line that just happened as I was writing the first draft. Subsequent drafts are more, for me, kind of technically minded. I'm kind of trying to make sure things like the structure are as tight as possible, making sure that the research that I've done is as accurate as possible, is kind of bolstering the story, things like that. But the language and the kind of intuitiveness of the structure, I think, is something that I just do in the first draft. There's I want to attribute it to Dr. O, but it might be a different writer. But he said that writing is like driving a car in the pitch black dark with your headlamps on. You can only see the little stretch of road in front of you, but that stretch gets you to the next stretch, which gets you to the next stretch, and eventually you get there. And that's how I feel like my process is.
Well said, and I'm glad you quoted Dr. O. For many people, whether they're professors or English teachers or people who profess to love literature, they always talk about the first line of a book, Call Me Ishmael. Your first line in this book, whenever I think of my mother, I picture a queen-size bed with her lying in it, a practiced stillness filling the room. Was that the first line that you wrote for the first line, or did you go back and come up with that?
That is the first line that I wrote for the first line.
Just writing. All right. Let's move to some questions. We've got one from Carolina. How did you better your writing skills? Your choice of diction and figurative color are amazing and mesmerizing, and it moved. But that's generally the question.
Oh, thank you. I really truly believe that it is all attributed to the reading. I read far more than I write. I try to read as much as possible, read as widely as possible, read things that challenge me, both in terms of what the subject matter is, but also challenge me in terms of the way that they use language. And all of those experiences, I think, seep their way into my own consciousness. And really, without trying, without thinking about it, suddenly I've gotten a little better, and I don't know which book to thank for that. I just know that that there is some book that has left me with something that's made my work just a little bit better. And because I believe that, I try to read as much as possible and absorb as much of the goodness of other people's work as I possibly can.
That makes perfect sense. I was a better writer after The Color Purple than before, so I always say Alice Walker. We have a question from Kristen. There aren't many books that integrate science to the level you have here. Were there some other authors that have tackled science topics in fiction that helped inspire you, like Andrea Barrett or Umberto Eco or others?
Oh yeah, that is a great question. There isn't a lot of fiction that has a scientist as its protagonist, that have scientists as their protagonists. I was really inspired by, or books that I've read that I've really loved that I think work in this vein, are The Overstory by Richard Powers, which I think is more, it's more kind of environmental science, but there's still, you can tell when you're reading it, that there's that kind of research grounded literature to it. But while I was reading this, I really wanted it to kind of read almost like memoir. And so something that I was looking at were things that I would call kind of sciencey creative nonfiction, in order to inform the style a little bit. So books like Eula Biss's On Immunity, Siddhartha Mukherjee's The Emperor of All Maladies, Atul Gawan's Being Mortal, and Paul Kalanithy's When Breath Becomes Air. And I think that style was something that I wanted to kind of absorb a little, a scientist who was speaking about their life and their work.
And they have to speak about their life as well as their work for it to work. So
Exactly.
okay, so we've got a question from the team. Did you ever experience any of the same kind of racism that Gifty did? And do you want to comment about what's going on today as we're living through this global pandemic and this racial pandemic and one other pandemic in America? But can you talk a little bit about whether any of that informed your writing?
Well, sure. I grew up really similarly to Gifty as one of the sole people in a predominantly white neighborhood of a town that's actually pretty racially mixed. But we lived on the southeast side of Huntsville, which was predominantly white, and we attended a church that was predominantly white as well. And so I think some of those elements of feeling kind of isolated, of not getting this sense of kind of belonging fully to the community that I was in, not really understanding how to negotiate my race and my ethnicity, like those kinds of questions. And I think also the Black respectability politics that that Gifty is often kind of grappling with in this book are ones that I'm really familiar with. Those ideas of needing to be twice as good to get half as far, that kind of messaging, I think, is one that was very much in the air when I was a child. And thankfully now I think we're starting to see some turning away from that. We're certainly starting to see a lot more interrogation of just of what the everyday lived experience of racism is in this country. I don't know what this moment means, what it will bring to bear in the future, but it feels like, for me, at least in my lifetime, to be a moment of one of those kind of hinge points in history where great change might be possible. And so I'm as eager to do my part to bring that about as I've ever been, and I'm hoping and hopeful that we will see some progress.
Your lips to God's ears.
Yeah.
We have another person who knows you. It says, "Hi, Yaa. Congratulations on another stunning book. I'm so in awe of you, who was my very first co-worker in a small tech startup in San Francisco. You're moving on to become a New York Times best-selling author." They're very excited. Was someone who had a brief stint in tech. How did your time spent in the Bay Area surrounded by tech bros impact your perspective on depicting humans? And that's from Shirley. Shirley.
Oh, how amazing. Hi, Shirley. Yeah, Shirley and I were hired at the same startup right out of college. So that was our first job out of college, and that's wonderful that you're here. Thanks, Shirley. Yeah, well, I suppose one thing that this book addresses is kind of the work environment. We get to see these moments of Gifty in her lab interacting with her colleagues, particularly her lab mate, Han. And I think those kinds of, I've had, I suppose it depends on how you look at it. I've had the great fortune, or perhaps the misfortune, of not having colleagues for any other time of my life except for that year that I worked at that tech startup. So I think it probably did inform some of those interactions that are expressed in the book. But mostly, I think, also trying to kind of capture that sense of that time living in the Bay Area when everyone is kind of working in similar fields towards similar goals, and to be somebody, as Gifty is, who is slightly in a different field, and what that feels like to kind of stand out in that way, and to still kind of seek excellence in the field that you are in.
Well, we've got time for one more question, and there's one here from Solange Patterson. I loved Homegoing. I've never seen generational trauma painted so clearly before. There were a lot of moments where the events were too heavy and I had to put the book down and come back to it. How was it for you writing about all of the tragic and painful things that happened to the characters?
Yeah, I always say that the writing in so many ways is easier than the research, because at least when I was writing, I could kind of console myself with the fact that ultimately this book was fiction, but I had some element of control over the things that were happening to the characters. I could set it down and go do something else and kind of ease my mind in that way. But the research doesn't provide that same escape. Every time that I sat down to read about these narratives of things that had happened to real people, I couldn't offer myself those same consolations. And so I think it's always harder to read about something, or for me, it's harder to read about something than to write fiction about the thing. So the research was really heavy, really difficult. I think for any kind of terrible atrocity that occurs in homegoing, there is something of equal or worse situation that happened to a real person. And I always had to kind of keep that in my mind as I was writing, that I was writing into a lineage of a kind of trauma that already existed, but I didn't have to embellish, and I didn't have to kind of rub it in anyone's faces, that it was something that was real, and just simply to acknowledge it and put it down on the page was almost a kind of reprieve. I felt this element of control over it that allowed me to feel just more connected to the things that I was reading. But yes, certainly it was a difficult experience.
I can't even imagine, but the fact that it was done so beautifully, it's almost like those things that, it's painful but beautiful. So that gets you through it a little bit.
Yeah.
The last question belongs to the team. Before we get ready to slide out of here, we want to thank all of our audience so much. This was amazing. I can't tell how many people were here. There were a lot. There were 230, the last time I had a chance to look. But I want to tell everybody who's here tonight and everybody who hears about this and watches the recording later, we don't want you to miss our upcoming conversation with Kate Walbert on October 6th. She'll be talking about her new book, She Was Like That, a collection of stories about motherhood. And you can register at the National Writer Series website. So we want to end with this question. A book this great that gets that many awards, and it's a saga and people love sagas, is there any chance that this is going to become a movie? Has someone already talked about it?
Oh, that's a great question. It has been optioned for I think they want to do a television miniseries, but who knows when that will happen. Fingers crossed that it actually gets made.
Well, it's been a long time since I read a book that impacted me like this one did. So I can't wait to read Homegoing, because then that's going to change that. A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, Betty Smith, when I was very young. So thank you for that and for this amazing thing. Thanks everybody for joining us tonight. And I'll talk to you later, Yaa, about who should play the two sisters.
Yes, please let me know.
Keep up with the schedule on the National Writer Series website, where you can learn about all the upcoming events, including the one that I just mentioned, which is coming up on October 6th. I want to thank all of the people on the chat. You didn't get to see all of the amazing comments, everything from "you are amazing," the book was mesmerizing, thank you so much. We want to thank all of those folks who felt that way and who expressed that way. And we can't wait for the next book. Is it coming soon?
It's anyone's guess when it's coming, but hopefully not too long.
Well, we will be there when you're ready, and please come and see us in Michigan. Traverse City is lovely, 4 seasons a year.
Oh, wonderful.
Everyone, thank you so much for being here, and good night.
Thank you.